Alright, Days of Glory. Rules. Chapter 6, Facing in Zones of Control. Units must be faced such that the top of the counter, which is also the side with the colored stripe, which is behind the unit name, that faces a hex vertex. So therefore, each unit is facing 2 forward hexes. Those are front hexes. The other 4 hexes around are considered rear hexes. So these are important little particulars here. So all infantry and cavalry units stacked in the same hex must have the same facing. All artillery units in the same hex must have the same facing, but they can have a different facing than the infantry or cavalry that they are stacked with. Alright, there is an exception. Units in town, village, or castle hex, as well as units in square, are considered to have 6 front hexes all the way around, or considered to be facing in 6 hex side directions. Alright, so effects of facing. Facing has no effect on movement. A unit is free to change facing without cost during or at the end of its movement. Units which leave square and disordered or routed units which rally may choose their facing freely. Facing does have an effect on combat. A unit may not fire, charge, or engage in shock combat unless doing so into or through its 2 front hexes. A unit being attacked through one of its rear hexes is penalized, as you would expect, and those are summarized on the shock and charge table. Units which are considered to have 6 front hexes, except for squares, may attack through any of their 6 hex sides, but with a die roll modifier of -1. Simply face the counter toward the hex it intends to attack before resolving the combat. The units in question are only required to attack the adverse units situated in their usual 2 front hexes, as if they had only 2 front hexes. I guess that's another particular point to remember. Although this is another point that is probably more obvious in play, in practice. Alright, zones of control, definition first. The zone of control represents the influence exercised by a unit beyond the unit it occupies. All units all units exercise a ZOC into its 6 adjacent hexes. There are exceptions though. First, artillery units, units in square, and routed units do not exercise or exert a ZOC. ZOCs do not extend across hex sides that are impassable to the unit. ZOCs do not extend across bridges and fords over impassable rivers. ZOCs do not extend from the exterior to the interior of a fortification, a castle, or a redoubt wall, even if that hex side is crossed by a trail or road. Okay. Effects of ZOCs. A unit must cease its movement as soon as it enters an enemy ZOC, although it can still change facing as it enters the hex, which is, I always thought that was strange wording, as it enters the hex, but I guess that means this isn't a frozen the moment you enter. You can move adjacent to an enemy and then still change facing. Okay. Exception 1, recoil, retreat, or route movement. That's an exception. And then we have cavalry pursuit, which is also an exception. Alright. To enter an enemy ZOC does not cost additional movement points. Exception, a unit in disorder must expend +1 movement point to enter an enemy ZOC. This game actually has a fair number of exceptions, actually, for the total number of pages of rules, so yeah, quite a number. An artillery unit cannot enter a hex in an enemy ZOC unless the hex is occupied by at least 1 friendly unit or 1 friendly infantry or cavalry unit. Okay. A unit that is in an enemy ZOC at the beginning of the activation phase may leave the ZOC, remain in place, and if desired, change facing 1 vertex maximum. Okay, so there's a limit. So there are limitations at times on a unit as far as how many vertices a unit can rotate through. A unit may leave an enemy ZOC by expending 1 MP. Okay, so you don't pay usually to go in, but you expend 1 movement point to leave an enemy Zoc, including the cost of the first hex terrain. But it may not move directly into a front hex Zoc of an enemy unit. Okay. Okay. So in that sense, you can in effect pin a unit, although it's not really pinning per se in a real world sense, but in game terms, it is possible to pin a unit. Yeah. But it's not easy. It's not just that you move adjacent to an enemy. Okay. And it may not move directly or indirect. That's funny. It may not move directly or indirectly from one hex to another in the Zoc of the same enemy unit. Okay, I guess what it means is you can't leave, move around, and then come back into the Zoc of the same enemy unit. I guess that's what they mean here by indirectly. All right, exception. There are quite a number of exceptions, but I will say they make sense though. It's not like it's an overabundance of exceptions. Charged by a cavalry unit already in an enemy Zoc. Charged by a cavalry unit already in an enemy Zoc. Oh yeah, okay. Zocs affect recoil and retreat after combat as described under Zoc restrictions, but they also affect refusal of shock and route movement by the adversary. So again, this idea of refusal of shock, maybe it's just the terminology. Maybe this is what other games call, retreat before combat or something like that. Okay. Then we have artillery fire. Definitions of fire. There are 3 kinds of artillery fire, although they're all pretty obvious. Normal fire. An artillery unit may fire when the formation it belongs to is activated. Normal fire affects all units in the target hex. That's important. So that's normal fire. Then you have counterbattery fire. An artillery unit which is the target of fire by an enemy artillery unit may employ counterbattery fire. Counterbattery fire is resolved immediately after the results of the initial enemy fire are applied. So you stop right after an enemy artillery unit fires at one of your artillery units. You assess the result, then you can fire right back at that enemy artillery unit. Counterbattery fire affects only the artillery unit on top of the adverse stack, the opposing stack. When resolving the fire, take into account all possible modifiers except the modifier for massed targets. And then you have reaction fire. So this is what I knew there was some type of reaction fire, but reaction fire in this game is actually quite limited. So an artillery unit which is the target of shock or charge by 1 or more enemy units may employ reaction fire against an attacking unit situated in one of its front hexes. Reaction fire affects only the top unit in an attacking stack. But if the latter is an artillery unit, the unit immediately below it, may be chosen as the target instead. Okay. Moreover, when the fire is resolved, all applicable modifiers are used except the one for massed targets. All right, so that's reaction fire. During an enemy activation, an artillery unit is not allowed to employ both counter-battery fire and reaction fire. It can employ only one of the two at the owning player's choice or option, and only one time during that activation phase. Okay. So, therefore, I'm getting your artillery unit could conduct a number of different instances of any combination of counter-battery and reaction fire, as long as it's once per enemy activation phase. Okay. So now we have restrictions on fire. An artillery unit in disorder may not fire. Fire occurs before movement. An artillery unit may fire only within the cone of fire defined by extending its 2 front hexes. That makes sense. An artillery unit may, however, change facing while remaining in the same hex and fire during the same activation phase. This change of facing, limited to one vertex, is not considered to be movement. On the other hand, an artillery unit may not change facing before counterbattery fire or reaction fire. Okay, that makes sense. An artillery unit that has an enemy unit in one of its front hexes must fire, at it. If there are enemy units in both of its front hexes, it may choose either target. Okay, so an artillery unit that has an enemy unit in one of its front hexes must fire at it. So this is, you can't fire beyond at some distant target when you have one in your front hex, in your front hexes. Okay. This restriction also applies to two artillery units stacked together and is in force both before and after any change in facing. Exception. If an artillery unit has the opportunity to perform counterbattery fire against a non-adjacent enemy artillery unit, it is not required to fire at an adjacent target. Okay, so I guess more or less under normal circumstances, you have to fire at the near unit, but you can fire more distant counterbattery fire even if you have an enemy in your front hex. That makes sense again, because it's a different purpose. Yes, that's how I'll think of it in my mind. It's the purpose of the fire is different. All right, fire strength and range. An artillery unit which is not in disorder fires by employing its fire strength, modified as necessary by various factors. Two artillery units stacked in a single hex may either fire independently at the same or different targets, or combine their fire against the same target if they belong to the same formation. To do the latter, the fire strengths of the two units are not added together. Instead, the unit with the higher strength is used and a DRM of +2 is added to the die roll when fire is resolved. Okay. Artillery units also have a range for effective fire and a maximum range. Okay, these ranges are given as the number of hexes separating the firing artillery unit and the target unit. Count the hex the target unit is in, but not the hex the firing unit is in. The effects of these ranges are given in the table of die roll modifiers for artillery fire. Okay. Then we have a special case. If several artillery units combine their fire against the same target but are at different ranges from it, apply the least favorable modifier. Now, of course, they just leave it, apply the least favorable modifier. That must be least favorable to the firing artillery. Least favorable. So basically you have to use the worst modifiers, okay, for ranges. Yeah. All right, line of sight in artillery unit. This is pretty simple, straightforward, but an artillery unit must be able to trace a line of sight. Line of sight is traced from the center hex to center hex. Cannot be blocked by obstructions, obviously. So what are blocking obstructions? Hexes at a level that is higher than the fire and the target. Okay, so intervening obstruction. Hexes containing a village, woods, an orchard, a palm grove, or a unit, whether friendly or enemy. Crest hex sides, steep slope hex sides, redoubt hex sides, and fortification hex sides. All right, so they're just kind of listed. Exception: if the loss crosses a redoubt hex side or a fortification hex side, the line of sight is not blocked if the fire and/or target are adjacent to that hex side. Okay, that's a standard. Effects of hex sides: when the loss passes exactly along the side of one blocking hex, such as a village or woods, the loss is not blocked. Okay, that's good. That's the way I like it. So terrain does not fill a perfect hexagon. That's the way I like to remember it. So passing exactly along the side of a blocking hex does not block the line of sight. However, if it passes along the hex sides of two blocking hexes, one to the left and the other to the right. Oh, I like how they specify that. The loss is blocked. Okay. When the loss passes exactly along a blocking hex side, when the loss passes exactly along a blocking hex side, such as a crest or steep slope, it is blocked. And I can remember that because that is considered hex side terrain. Not, of course, that real world terrain conforms to the perfect hexes, but since it is hex side terrain, That's just easier to remember. So that does block line of sight, okay. Obstructions and levels of elevation. An obstruction is ignored for determination line of sight if. So I guess this is how can you see over obstructions. Fire and the target are both at a higher level of elevation than the obstruction. So that's literally looking over from higher to higher elevations. The fire is at a higher level of elevation than the target and the obstruction is halfway between the fire and the target or closer to the fire. Okay, I like this. So this is angled line of sight. And then there's a last bullet here. The target is at a higher level of elevation than the fire and the obstruction is halfway between the fire and the target or closer to the target. So that's the reverse of the bullet I just said. But this is nice. This is what I prefer. If you're not going to have absolutely true type map elevation reading in the spirit of like Tactical Combat Series, then at least have, again, what I call here the the angled line of sight. So yeah, line of sight at close range. Fire is always allowed at point blank range with fire and target adjacent, except through a crest hex side or steep slope hex side. And again, that makes sense considering the Napoleonic era battlefields at this scale. Resolution of fire. To resolve fire by an artillery unit, the player rolls 1d10 and adds the fire strength of the unit, taking into account the list of die roll modifiers for artillery fire. And these are cumulative, and finds the result on the fire table. Now, clarification, if the result is CT, okay, I think that's cohesion test, each unit affected by the fire result must test individually. Yeah. So, you fire at a hex, normal fire is against the hex as a whole, and so all units that are in the target hex conduct a separate cohesion test individually.